So this was me probably, I don't know, in the year of 2011 or 2010. At that point, I had been using Linux regularly for like 3 years or something. And I just wanted to give back to the community because I was always amazed that like there's all this free open source stuff that I get for free. I should contribute some back. And yes, my hair really looked like that back then. You know, age isn't always kind. And so first my idea was, you know, maybe I want to contribute something to the Linux kernel. Then I learned about Linus Torvalds and how he treats people, and was like, nah, not going to do that. That's not the thing I want to do. And I was lucky because at my university there was actually this course. This is the exact course page from when I took that course, which is like development processes in open source projects, which was led by now Professor Dr. Martin von Löwes, who actually has a lifetime achievement award for its contributions to the Python language. So that guy knows what he's talking about, and like, he's a really cool lecturer. And as a part of this program, we were told that we should fix a bug in a huge open source project, like not just like something small, but like in something like Firefox or something. So I was like, okay, this is the thing. This is my start to my open source career. I will fix a bug in something. And I chose this bug in gedit, which, believe it or not, was the editor for Ruby I was using at the time, with like a ton of plugins, and like it was really cool. And the feature I really wanted was to use the middle click on the tab to close that tab, because that didn't work, and it works like in Firefox and other stuff. So I was like, hey, this should work here. And I found a bug that was already open for this, and I was like, okay, let's roll, let's do this. And so I was fired up. It's like, come on, we're gonna get to this. And I actually submitted a patch, but like getting there, which, you know, from that patch you might not think, it took an eternity. I actually had to enlist the help of my very good friend, Nico, because this was C. I'm not a good C programmer. And it was like some weird object-oriented C. And so like it took quite a while. Like it took weeks to just make that change, or even get the thing compile on my machine, because I knew nothing about all of that. So I tried to switch distros to have newer packages until I realized I will never have as current packages as I needed. And so found some build tool, did it through that. Took me forever. And I fixed it with all of his work. And I felt really good about myself because I managed to do this. But then there is this comment here where it just says like, oh yeah, thanks for your bug report. It's actually a duplication of another bug report. And when you go to the other bug report, it actually says that this feature isn't wanted. I feel compelled to tell you that this issue was open for, I think, almost a year or something, and none like that happened. And so this was me. I was completely destroyed. I was completely sad. And at this point, this might have already been the end of this talk, because I did a lot of needless work. Because if somebody had just triaged this issue and just been like, yeah, you know, this is a duplication, we don't want this, la, 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 I wouldn't have sat there and spent a week of my lifetime trying to contribute to something. And like, most importantly, I felt there was absolutely no appreciation. That message was just like, thanks for the bug report, not thanks you kiddo that just, you know, sent a patch and spent a lot of time doing this. Like there was nothing. It was like I was invisible. So I felt very, very bad. And I got very frustrated. And so I felt that, you know, open source just isn't for me. Maybe this isn't for me. I don't want to do open source. And like this sucks. And so we could have ended the talk here. No, this is not a lightning talk, so we'll have an actual talk that we'll talk about. So this talk is called Stories in Open Source. Hi, my name is Toby. You can find me everywhere on the internet as @practop. I'm starting Monday, actually. I'm an engineer at Screenverse, so right now I'm unemployed, but still there. I'm from Berlin. I run the Ruby user group in Berlin for the past 12 years. And a lot of that is also through open source. And today, this is the most personal talk I've ever done. I will walk you through my story in open source and how it impacted my life and what I learned from open source. And another thing to know about me is that I was also that guy that during the Zendesk talk, when Frieren came up, I was the guy that was like, woo, Frieren! And I was like, oh yeah, that guy knows Frieren. So that's me. I can do that because I even have a Frieren sticker on my laptop, so I'm officially allowed to go crazy when Frieren is mentioned. And sort of like reflecting on that, I also noticed that like this is a lot like Frieren, because how I would describe the anime is it's someone that took a long journey before with someone else and then takes new people on a journey together and tells them all about their old journey. And like in that way, I feel like this old sage right now that takes you through my old journey throughout all the open source projects that I've worked on and what I did, and hopefully maybe also take some of you with me on a new journey of contributing to open source. One more thing, just before we get started, like I'm not a core contributor to Rails or to Ruby, like none of these super big projects. Like the biggest projects I maintain or have maintained is SimpleConf, which is still big, but like not super big. But I think that's okay. Because like most of us will never end up probably maintaining one of the super large projects, and so I think my experience is actually more relevant to you than the experience of a Rails core contributor. And my story actually starts in Sweden, because I moved to Sweden for my Erasmus. There I had some more time. Och nu ska vi prata lite svenska. Vem här är svensk eller pratar svenska? Det är inte så många. Men okej. Så jag heter Tobi, jag kommer från Berlin. Och i 2011 jag åkte till Karlskrona. Och Karlskrona, det är härligt. Det är jättehärligt. Och jag studerade programvaruteknik på Blekinge Tekniska högskolan. Jag har ätit glass på glaciären. Det går jättebra, jag måste göra det. Jag vet vem Urup är. Jag var på en Urup-konsert, men jag gillar Refused mer. Men nu är vi på Malmö, och så ska vi prata lite engelska med den andra. Det är bra. Okej. Okay, back to English. I'm sorry, I have to showcase my Swedish every time I give a talk in Sweden, so that's like, it's a rule. I can't. So I went to Sweden, I went to this university, and except for the courses of Darja Schmitte, most of the courses were far more relaxed and chill than in my home university. So I actually had the time. And when I had time, I found this thing, which was called the Mendicant University, or Ruby Mendicant University, which was run by Gregory Brown. Some might know him from Prawn, and he also wrote like a very good book about Ruby. And it was a very intense course where I think it was 5 weeks, and you could be kicked out every week, and you needed to accomplish milestones. And it was me as like a master student and a bunch of senior engineers. So that was already fun. And part of that course was you had to contribute to open source. So that was my second shot at it. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to try and contribute to open source. And this is my last shot at it. And I found Shoes, which is a wonderful Ruby project to build UI applications, desktop applications. That's something I always wanted to do. Like I tried it with like GTK or something, and that sucks. You need to position everything. And Shoes is beautiful, it's wonderful. So what we do, we create a new app, and then we give it a background that has like a gradient from lime to blue, and the layout works more like in a web application, so stack just goes below each other, flow goes next to each other. We create a paragraph, we can create just a button, and then, of course, the block will be executed when you click it. And I mean, the last line always fascinates me the most, because in most UI applications, if you wanted to display an image from an URL, you would need to write code to download that and do that, but Shoes just does this for you. And I got to know Shoes through like this guy and the presentation I watched. This was, I think, the first Ruby conference presentation I ever watched. Can anybody recognize who that guy is? Just shout out the name. Nobody? No? No, that is not Y. That is a good guess, but Y by that point had been gone for 1 or 2 years. So this was the post-Y, the lucky stiff period. So, correct, Steve. That is Steve Klapnik. So Steve Klapnik was the first person to, back then, take over Y and like try to categorize his projects, keep the projects running. And Steve was also part of Mendicant University. So I reached out to Steve to work on it. And so, by the way, like the illustrations are not going to get better throughout the talk. They're only going to get worse, like deal with it. So this is sort of, to me, what it looked like working on Shoes. So you have Steve back there with his long, cool hair, me there, there's my friend Jason, there's my friend Eric, and then there's SBB somewhere. And we're just building something incredibly fun, because like nobody wanted to use this in production. We wanted to use it to teach people how to program, or just to have fun. It was just like, oh, let's do this, la la la, let's do this. It was a very fun and welcoming environment. And I really mean this, like this is still the best open source community I've ever seen. And it still, to this day, sort of like impacts how I deal with open source communities. In the beginning, I was writing Steve private emails all the time until someone told me, like, maybe don't write Steve private emails all the time, maybe use the mailing list or the issue tracker. But like, he never told me that. He was just always open and welcoming. And that was absolutely amazing to me. And I made so many friends. So like, Jason, like, if you've watched the movie Inside Out, I know the second one is out, I haven't watched that yet, but there's this concept of a core memory. And I have so many core memories just from that group of people. So like Jason, after years of working with him on shoes, I met him for the first time on the beach in Barcelona during Full Stack Fest. Eric Watson, I've never met him, but we once paired on an issue, and he suggested a time of like 10 my time. I was like, man, 10 my time? Isn't that like 4 in the morning in your time? What are you doing? Do you want to do this before the kids get up? Because he has like 6 children. And he was like, yeah, exactly that. But our coding session went long, and so as we were coding, like in the background, more and more kids were running in because I think he was sitting in the hallway or something. And at some point, like I think his smallest kid came and he had like a little truck in his hand and came around with it. And Eric said, like, do you want to show this to my friend Toby? And then he held it in the camera and showed me. And to this day, this moment just melts my heart. And yeah, so I sadly never managed to see him. I saw Steve a bunch of times, Jason a bunch of times by now, and even like one guy, Davor, was from Sweden. He was from Lund, and I visited him and like stayed at his place. So I made a lot of friends in that project. The other thing that I learned is that you should give people access. I mean, is Sam still here? Like maybe he might disagree with me saying like give people access to your open source repos very early and very nicely, not to the publishing rights, but just the code, because if you're a first-time contributor, somebody giving you, like, you have access to this repository now, you are a maintainer of this, that's such a huge thing. Like, for me, every time it was like, wow, these people trust me enough. And so after some PRs, just give them access. People will be so happy, and there will be a big motivation boost to continue working on this. And the other thing I would say is release early, release often. So we were working on Shoes 4, which was second system syndrome. We had a good reason for it. The old Shoes was not as you would imagine. It wasn't a gem. Shoes incorporated the Ruby interpreter. So it wasn't a gem. Shoes had Ruby inside of it, and it was lots of C code. It was very weird to deal with. So we had a good reason to do all of that. And we did it in JRuby and SWT. But like one of the most stupidest things I think I ever did in my life was like, yeah, we're only going to release it as a gem once it's 100% compatible with the old Shoes 3. And that's just stupid. Like, I'm sorry, my past self, but that's what it is. Because if we release stuff, it's much easier for people to install, to try out, to report bugs, to get people in the community, to get people reporting. So like, just put out a 0.1 version, tell people about it, maybe they'll try it out, and then continue iteratively improving. Thankfully, at some point, Jason said, like, no, Toby, you're wrong. We're going to release it now. And we did. And so I was very happy about that. And the other very important thing that I learned about from this is that you are not your open source. So for me, Shoes was part of my identity. At one point, I had a 600-day GitHub streak just with Shoes. And it was hard for me to stop and move on to another project because I felt like I owed it to the community and to everyone that I finished Shoes, that it be 100% compatible with Shoes 3, although I wanted to do other stuff. And it took a long conversation with my friend Arne to be like, okay, if I don't enjoy doing Shoes anymore, it's okay for me to do something else. My next project I want to talk about is AfterDo, which probably no one here knows. It's a very fun little micro library which implements aspect-oriented programming in Ruby. That is a coding technique that maybe some people know from Java, but basically you can say like after or around or before a method, do this thing. One of the premier use cases is something like logging. I actually built this because we needed to choose because we had a cross-cutting concern. That's what it's used to solve. Which was when do we trigger redraw? And then so we just implemented this to like say like, okay, this was an action that changed the UI state, so we need to trigger redraw after this action is done, basically. And that's why I implemented it and they pulled it out to its own little library. And that's what it looked like. It's like, it's very fun. Like it's a fun little micro library. It's like 100 lines of Ruby code because Ruby is great at meta programming, so like this rocks. And the other thing that I learned that usage is wild. Like you saw almost the entire API in the previous slide. And I always thought about putting some meta level on top of it, but I never did it. And then I got an issue from someone who proposed such a meta layer. And his meta layer looked completely different, had a completely different use case, was completely useless to me, but obviously useful to this person. So I was like, okay, it's just cool if my library just has this little surface and people can build whatever on top, and like I don't need to prescribe them a new meta layer to use. Then we have Benchy. As you realize, this is not Ruby anymore, this is Elixir. And Benchy is a micro-benchmarking library that I wrote in Elixir. And I mean, you can mostly see how it works. And so this is what Benchy looks like to me, essentially. I love benchmarking. It's very nice because sometimes you build a product and you want to build something good, but it's hard to measure that. With benchmarking, I can be like, yes, I made that 20% faster. I won. This is a game. I can make it even faster. Like, I don't know. I really enjoy it. I also, for fun, I write blog posts comparing the performance of different Ruby implementations against each other, like Truffle Ruby versus JRuby versus C Ruby. Like, I just enjoy doing that. So I really like that. And one of the most important things here to learn was learn as you go. Like Benchy was my first Elixir project. I started back in 2016, I believe. And there's a common misconception. Like oftentimes people come to me and they're like, Toby, it's so great that you wrote Benchy. I don't know the beam well enough to write Benchy, but you know the beam so well, and so only you could have written Benchy. And I tell them, no. It's the other way around. I didn't write Benchy because I knew the beam well. I know the beam well because I wrote Benchy. I learned so much just for implementing Benchy. And we implemented memory measurement. And for instance, my friend Devin gave a great talk about memory management in the beam. All of which, the entire 30-minute talk, we learned while we were implementing memory measurement in Benchy. We didn't know this before. But like we grow. When you work on something that is fun to you, you will learn more about it. Like you don't need to be an expert to work on it. You will learn it while you work on it. And this, I think, is one of my most important messages today. The other thing that I learned is that being better than another library actually isn't enough for adoption. So there was another library for benchmarking in Elixir. And first, obviously, I tried to contribute to that library because like splitting, especially a small ecosystem, is never a good idea. But my pull requests were ignored for about 2 weeks. And also the library had lots of commented out code. There were no tests. So I didn't really feel great about the library. So I said, like, OK, maybe it's good if I do my own version. And even like the first version that I released of Benchy, I think was much better than that library. Like objectively speaking, like it supported all its features and more statistics, more this, more that. So, but it took 2 or 3 years until Benchy even like overtook it in daily or weekly downloads, or maybe a year, and then even more until it overtook it in overall downloads. I know. And so it's not just enough to write a library and people won't just start using it. You need to write blog posts, you need to go to conferences and give talks, you need to do all of that to get people on board with your library. And even then it will take like a really, really long time, so it's a long game. You gotta be very patient. And the other thing that I discovered there is the joy of having co-maintainers. I mean, I had this with shoes, but there, my friend Devin, one day we were just sitting together, we had a problem, and we just discussed basically naming. What are the concepts in Benchy called, and how can we change these concepts to fit better in this data structure? We just sat at my home for 2 hours and just discussed naming. And it got so much better through it, and we still use the same concepts, the same data structures. They're in there until today, and this was, I don't know, 7 years ago. And yeah, it is great to really contribute to an ecosystem in this degree. So this is the book, Adopting Elixir, and there is an entire page in it about benchmarking, and it uses Benchy. And that for me was like a gigantic achievement because it was like, wow, this is my library. I created this, and this is like, Joseph Lim is a co-author of this book, and like lots of other cool people. And I know that Joseph Lim uses it to improve the performance of Elixir itself. I know it's used to improve the performance of Erlang, and so I'm very proud that like I made this, or like we, all the contributors, made this contribution to the Elixir and Erlang ecosystem. So now we get to SimpleCoff, which I teased before. And so this is what SimpleCoff looks like to me. So what is SimpleCoff? SimpleCoff is the code coverage library that you use in Ruby if you use one, I guess, these days, or still. But yeah. it is a huge legacy open source project. And so that's why it's really big, and that stuff keeps breaking left and right. So you do have like a very big joy of impact in the sense that, SimpleCoff has, I don't know how many downloads, like I think more than 200 million or something. So if you improve something, you're gonna make it better for a lot of people. But on the other side, you also know if something's broken, it's broken for a lot of people, maybe, and that's also like a little bit stressful. And specifically, SimpleCoff is a huge integration nightmare because it needs to integrate with everything. All the different test frameworks, RSpec, Minitest. I know people here really seem to love Minitest, but like them, the process at exit thing competes with our process at exit thing. There was once a time when I think I did 3 or 4 patch releases within 2 days just for Minitest. So like my relationship with Minitest is a bit strained, I have to say. And then, Sam comes along and is like, oh, implement, trusted publishing, which we did yesterday. It was fine. Thank you, Sam. But, there's always these things. You have parallel test runners. Then Rails builds their own parallel test runner. Then Ruby adds more code coverage methods. It's a lot of things that you need to do and that need doing. And that's tough to keep up with. And honestly, I didn't go into SimpleCoff and like, oh, I want to become a maintainer. I only wanted to have JRuby support because Shoes used JRuby support, used JRuby and SimpleCoff and wanted to be officially supported. So I went to Hamburg and I met the original author of it, Christoph. And like he was like, yeah, okay, you can, do JRuby support. I'm like, okay, cool. I looked at the project, had like a gazillion open pull requests and open issues. So I was like, oh, well, I guess I'm a maintainer now and I'll work on this. But yeah. As it happens. I mean, it's actually nice. I mean, also kind of like a shout out, like actually Christoph organized for me to get funding from Ruby Together so that for some time I was actually paid working on SimpleCoff, which was always my dream, getting paid for open source work, even for a small period of time. So that was also very cool. But yeah, it seems like it's one of these things that it's hard to catch up with. And if you look at my commit graph, I also wasn't very active in the last couple of years, to be quite honest with you. But we'll also get to that. The last sort of like variety of open source project that I want to talk about is doing open source at work. And it usually looks like this. We say like, oh yeah, we should open source some stuff. We don't know what, but like, yeah, let's open source stuff. Oh, open source is cool. Do you do open source? La, 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 la. And the reality of it is usually quite different. That like somebody open source something, but nobody knows who's responsible for this. What are we doing? And it's like, and because there's so much actual work to be done, that the open source projects are kind of forgotten and lie around there. And so that's what it's been like at a lot of the companies I've worked at. So like I'm very happy, for instance, if something like at Varvid, when Pandit worked out, like I'm really, really thankful for that and it's really cool, but it takes a lot to pull that off. Because the question is always like, who is responsible for this? Like what are our priorities? Are we working on this? No. And it really takes someone that is really dedicated and goes there in their work free time, which is like very hard to get, and sometimes then in their own free time to go and work on these projects. And one thing that I also want to talk about that the folks from Zendesk also talked about, one thing that also counted into this is like, oftentimes people just say, oh yeah, we'll just go to fork this gem and maintain our own fork. Good luck, people, That is like, don't do that. I mean, they already said it, but like, don't do that. I mean, maybe do a fork, do your own stuff, but immediately do a pull request or before do an issue and like try to talk about it and try to get the change back mainline, because otherwise you'll be stuck in hell. Like rather than creating your own fork, work around it. Like maybe wrap the code in your own stuff if you want to add something that the maintainers don't want to add, or like really try to work with the open source project. A fork really isn't a great idea. So I talked to you about a lot of the good things, but I also already sort of like spoiled that I hadn't been as active in SimpleCoff for a while, and actually open source as a whole, I would say. And so why is that? So at some point, COVID hit, and I'm not sure what that was like for you, but for me, that was tough. Like, I didn't know what's happening in the world anymore. Like, I was glued to the TV news, like, almost the entire day. I was worried about the future. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't have the mind space, any mind space, to look and work with my open source code because I had other things occupying my mind. Then the next fucking thing happened. Russia further invades Ukraine, and like, by the way, further invades, Russia already invaded Ukraine way before. Just most of Europe chose to forget about it and just act like nothing ever fucking happened. And that my best friend was born in Ukraine. I was in Ukraine all 3 pre-pandemic years. So I was at Pivorak, great Ruby meetup there twice. I was in Kiev for a conference, and so I have friends there. I have a connection there. I have Ukrainian friends back home, and it's very important to me. And so that also really, fucked with me. What's going on in the world? And it's a war so close to home. When before almost my entire lifetime, I was born in '89, I didn't really have war in my conscious time close to home. Then there was also a bunch of there were layoffs at work. I mean, I wasn't affected. Nobody. I mean, okay, there were a couple of people that I knew were affected, but nobody in engineering at least was affected. There was also a lot of stress at work, and it's really hard to keep up with open source work when you're in these personal circumstances. And it gets worse. If you've ever contributed to one of my open source projects or seen any one of my talks between 2017 and now, you've seen a picture of my bunnies. At work, Remote is a more than 1,000 people company. Most people knew the names of all 3 bunnies. Like, just to give you sort of like what they mean to me and like how much they are a part of my identity. And so Ghost, which was my favorite bunny, she was born with a birth defect, and so she was stationary at the vet every 2 months for at least a weekend. And sometimes they were stationary at the vet for 3 weeks or something, and in acute danger of dying. And that happened multiple times. And that, of course, like, I also don't care about open source then, because then I have bigger issues to deal with. And also right now, like last year on the 17th of May, the last one of them, Ghost, who somehow, because although she was the sickest, she lived the longest, which she was a fighter. She died. And I didn't take that well, like not at all. Like, it took more than 2 months to be myself again. And now you're like, why is this guy telling us all of this personal stuff? Oh God, this is really uncomfortable. And I'm sorry for that, but as I said, it's a personal story. All of this really reminded me of when I was actually in Kiev, and I was walking around Kiev with my friend. Obviously, this is me and my friend Duana. Whoever knows Duana, you know that's Duana, and that's me. Like, very easy to see. And we're walking around there. I think this was 2018, and she was saying, like, Toby, how do you do it? Like, how do you run the Ruby user group Berlin? How do you do all of these open source contributions and still have time to like meet friends and do this? And how? And I was like, I never thought about this. I was just like, I just do. It's just what I do. It's just like, I was in there, it's normal. But during all of this time, now that I've been like off of open source for a large part of like all of these things that basically changed my life drastically, I kind of have forgotten to do it. Like, what used to be very easy to me was just like, okay, I work all day, then I go home, and then I do open source for 2 hours. That's not easy for me anymore. That now takes dedication from me, and so I always call back to this conversation, because at the time I was just, I don't know, I just do it, la la la. And this also takes me back to the first talk that I mentioned, which was, I think Steve gave this at RubyConf back then, so back in 2011, and he said open source is made of people. He also wrote a blog post about it back then, if anyone was around to remember. And he said that we have a big problem in open source of maintainers like burning out and people leaving the community and leaving the space. So like, if you don't know these folks, it's like top left is Zed Shaw, who wrote the quite infamous Rails is a Ghetto blog post, if some of the new ones want to look that up. Then top in the middle, we have Why the Lucky Stiff, who was the creator of shoes and lots of other great things, was a Ruby core committer and like great and very artistic person, and did things with metaprogramming that no human being should ever do, but like he still did, and I needed to maintain some of them. It was fun. We have Yehuda Katz. So he had left like 2 years before. Yehuda Katz, who is still around like in the JavaScript scene, but kind of like phased out of the Ruby scene at some point. Bottom right is Wayne Seguin, who used to be the maintainer of RVM before Michał Papis took over. And then bottom left, I mean, we all know Aaron Pedersen, so like I don't need to talk about him. And like Steve was thinking that Aaron was gonna burn out, which to me, like, I think Aaron Pedersen is the programmer that I respect the most. Like his combination of technical excellence, being funny, and just being a great person is just so unique. To me, and I love that we have Aaron in the Ruby community. So thankfully, Aaron did not burn out. So thankfully, Steve was wrong about that. And what do we do, and how do we take care of that? And like, I mean, for me, one of the ways that I take care of that is that my attitude is this. So open source is given to you free of charge with like a license, like, yeah, do whatever you want, but I'm not responsible for it. So like, open source owes you shit. And to me, this also means I owe you shit. Like, if there's a bug in it, you can go fix it. You can do a pull request. You can roll back to the last version, but it is not my life's responsibility to be aware of this. And like, that is, it might sound very harsh, but I need this, because especially towards shoes, I felt such a big responsibility that, like, yeah, it might have destroyed me if I hadn't taken off of that. And for SimpleCough, I know right now it's badly maintained. It's probably in like almost the state from like the number of open issues and open pull requests than when I took it over. And like, that is nagging at the back of my mind, but thankfully it's not nagging as loudly anymore, because I've changed my attitude towards it a bit, where I'm like, okay, other people can sit and we can do something, and I still want to get back and do something on it, but it helps me sleep better. But not to be too negative, right? So I'm not saying open source sucks. Like, that's not what I want to take away. Like, I love creating things, like the joy of creating shoes, Benchy, and also the joy of, you know, shipping new features and fixing bugs in SimpleCough is just great. But for instance, SimpleCough, you know, bug reports you get in SimpleCough is like, hi, code coverage is not working in my project, please fix. And you're like, great. What isn't working? What project? Can you do something about? Like, I can't do anything with that, and it's very annoying. So I would say, like, actually 90%, maybe 80% of all the new issues in SimpleCough are just user errors. I still remember when I read the README after I took it over, I was like, wow, they remind people a lot of times to first require SimpleCough and then start SimpleCough before any other code is loaded, because like, that's really annoying. I should maybe reduce that. 2 months into maintaining the project, I'm like, okay, I'm going to add some more notices that people should require and start it before, because people apparently can't read. So my message is also to take care of yourself, especially. I know we have lots of open source maintainers here also in the room. Like, take care of yourself. Like, take a break. Sometimes, you know, maybe you can do the release next week or next month. Take care of yourself, because if we start losing the open source maintainers and people, like, that's no good to anyone. Because like, the people on that slide, right, they're out for good. Like, you know, they haven't come back. I haven't seen them. And like, I would rather have someone take like a couple of years break and then do a little bit of work, or maybe be there around sometimes to ask some question, than them being gone wholly. And also, please be nice to people and to your maintainers, right? So I want to talk a bit about maybe not all of you are experienced open source contributors. So I also want to talk about, you know, taking your first steps into open source. So one of the most important things to me is like, please, 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 please report issues. If something happens and breaks, and you just go like, oh, this library is shit, and you move on to the next one, I never know about these issues. I can never fix them. That is one of my biggest fears. If you report issues, only then can I fix your issues. And I want to know about them. If you report them, please, you know, be nice to the people. And something that I always do, I always thank the maintainers first when I report an issue. I'm always like, hey, thank you very much for this library, because if I am reporting an issue in a library, that means that library was useful to me somehow. Like, either I've used it a lot and I found an issue, or I wanted to use it because it has something cool that I want that is there for free, and I ran into an issue. And so either way, it's always very helpful. And so I always thank everyone when I submit an issue. And then please minimize the issue, so not say like, SimpleCough doesn't work in my application. Like, create an open source repository showcasing, you know, where it doesn't work. So like, I mean, minimize is good when you say like, blah, 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 this, but if you give me a reproduction repo with like, here is the issue, or here's this code that exactly shows the issue that I'm having, where I think it should behave differently, I can fix that. You know, like, that's something I can do and fix. Otherwise, I'm just guessing around, and it's no fun to me, and it's no fun to you. And when you do that, you get messages like this from, I don't know, like, I reported some issue, but quite frankly, sometimes open source maintainers aren't being used to being treated so nicely and thanked. They're just like, oh, wow, this person is really nice to me. I'll go fix the issue. And I just wish that, you know, that was the norm, which, you know, sadly it isn't. And then, you know, when you report an issue or you want to have a new feature, discuss it. Like, don't send a pull request first. Just first create an issue, discuss the feature, maybe get some help on where to implement it, how to implement it, and then you can come up with a better solution, just like I hope you do at work. And then in the end, maybe, just maybe, add a pull request to fix the issue, actually. So that's just the last step. But I want to be very clear that all the steps before that, that are also open source contributions. If you add a comment to an issue, like, hey, we could fix it like this, so that's an open source contribution. I think we're overly focused on just code as a contribution. Like, no, typos is a contribution, documentation is a contribution, reporting an issue is a contribution. Just chiming in and saying, like, hey, this feature would also be very helpful to me in this context, that is also a contribution. It might not show up on your GitHub graph, but it is a contribution. You can see I get quite worked up about this topic. So, something else that I want to briefly talk about, as I've been reflecting about it quite a lot recently, is what is the difference between working in open source and working in an actual company? Because I found myself, like, these days, as you can see, or from the intro, I was looking and applying for jobs, and sometimes people are like, oh, how much experience do you have with remote work? And I'm like, I'm remote native. I worked remotely before I even worked in a job. Like, I was a student, I was doing open source. Like, my buddy Jason was over in the US, HPB was down there in Japan, Dava was up there in Sweden, Eric Watson, he was also in the US. Like, I worked with all of these people from all over the world. It was completely remote. Like, I didn't know any one of those. We didn't even have Slack or Discord. We communicated via mailing lists. And, and issues, it was funny. And sometimes in an issue where we just saw someone, like, we would be like, oh, hey, how are you doing? Like, in the issue, not on the mailing list, because, it was nice. And so it's also async native. All these people from all over the world work together, and they don't have any, or mostly not any sync communication or any sync time with each other. And also, what I would call it's work flexible, because like, I don't know how much Jason is going to work on like this issue in the next 2 weeks, because like he might have a family emergency. He might just not want to work on open source, whatever, It is a very challenging environment in that sense, because you're uncertain of so many things. And so whenever companies say that, like, oh, we don't think remote work is working, I'm like, excuse me, have you seen all of those open source projects all over the world and how they are developed? They're completely remote and completely async, and like they have it much harder than you have it in your company. And you think these can be successful and it can be successful in your company? I don't believe you. So to sort of like summarize it a little bit, please, like be nice. That's, I think, is one of the most important things. Be nice when you contribute. Be nice when you open an issue. Be nice as an open source maintainer also to people. And the open source, it's your time, right? Like it is a hobby. I'm not getting paid. Most of you aren't getting paid to do this. And so it's your hobby. And so sometimes, you might want to try a fancy new pattern. Maybe that's not, you shouldn't do that at work time, and it's not really necessary. But it's a hobby. Like, go do that. It's your open source project. It's your time. Do it. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm very much an advocate of keeping it simple everywhere. But in the end, it's a hobby. And if you don't want to work on an open source project anymore because you don't happen to use it anymore, like, don't. Go build something different. Be protective of your time. Be protective of your mental health. And really, all the adoption takes a lot of time. Like, as I said with Benchy, like Benchy was better day one, but it takes such a long time to get all the people up and running with it. And I mean, eventually it is the most used and it's good, but long and hard way until you get there. Needs lots of talks and blog posts and all of that. But I want to also talk a little bit more about some of the negative sides of open source. So first, it is seemingly even less diverse. Look around you. I'm sorry to say, but the Ruby community is already more diverse than most communities. But like open source is even less diverse than lots of the other communities out there. And there's reasons for that, right? Open source requires you to have a lot of free time that you can just spend for free on stuff, right? And usually minorities, or like not even minorities, also women are often much more likely to be a caregiver or caretaker or like have other responsibilities that like white dudes like myself just don't have, or like have, or like not as much. But I'm saying there's reasons for that, and it would be so much better if we could also make sure to make make our entire community, but also the entire open source space, a much more diverse space. The other question that I've hinted at a lot here is already the question of sustainability. Like, how long can we keep this going? There's this, famous image of like, this one library that this one guy maintains that nobody knows of, that the entire internet is based on. And that is very much true. And we can see stuff breaking all the time. And being nice to people is one thing, but also figuring out funding. So, for instance, it's really cool that like Sam now has a full-time position working on Ruby Gems. And like, you think about like Ruby Gems, bundler, like. Every Ruby and Rails company over the whole world uses that and relies on that in their day-to-day workflow. And they shouldn't have just one SAM, they should have 10 SAMs, Like, that is what the value to the community actually is like, but we don't value it in the same. We do have some GitHub sponsors and that stuff, but it's not all there. And lastly, one thought that I also here want to leave you with is, you do open source and you make it accessible and available to everyone. And that means everyone. That means, for instance, maybe the Russian military. That means the NSA spying on stuff. And so there was a really big spike in this when a company called Palantir, like there was a video of them, and they had books on like Sinatra on the shelf. And so, for instance, I know the original. I'm not sure if it's the creator, like Konstantin Hase, like he was the Sinatra man, and that was tough for him. It was tough for a lot of us because, like, okay, how culpable am I when sort of like Palantir uses my open source code to spy on people or to determine the location of the next bomb drop? And it's a tough topic, and I don't know the answers. Like, I'm not an ethics professor, but it's harsh to think about, and I think we should also be aware of that. Like, so I don't want to leave you with this sad news, so I want to recap something for you. So when I prepared this talk, I was thinking about like my entire open source journey, and I realized it was all shoes and like all that it did to me. So first, and to me most importantly, if you know me, I'm like I love my friends to death and back, and I made lots of friends. So this is me and Jason in Berlin at the Eurocamp conference, pair programming on the shoes issue. It's so fun. I mean, we're in touch to this day, and it's great. This is my friend Arne, that some of you might know. He wrote some really cool gems like Yaks. Like these days, he's more in the closure space. But he was the first person ever to recognize me for my open source efforts. I think it was like my third or fourth Ruby User Group Berlin meetup. I was just like on the way out, and then like this guy tapped me on the shoulder, like, "Excuse me, aren't you Toby from Shoes?" I'm like, "Yeah." And then we became friends, and like he started contributing to Shoes and doing all of that. And he's a friend of mine to this day. And it's so like these connections to people that we make for all of this time is just, it's just very special to me. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Also, all of my first talks were Shoes related. So first, when I came back from Sweden, I was like, okay, I got to tell people about Shoes and that we're doing Shoes for, that it's there and that it's alive and you can use it and that it's cool. So I gave a talk at the Ruby User Group in Berlin, which sent out this very, very nice tweet at the time, which I still treasure to this day. And then months later, the main organizer of the Ruby User Group Berlin had a kid and said he didn't have the time anymore. And I offered to take over, hoping that somebody else would take over. Nobody else offered, so here I am 12 years later. So me also running the Ruby User Group Berlin is also like a direct, basically descendant of me doing Shoes, because if I hadn't done Shoes, I might have never gone there. And so like I'm doing this, and like this is my life now, right? My first lightning talk was at Wroclaw AB. And I was sitting there, and they were saying they were going to do lightning talks, and I was sitting next to my buddy Arne. And Arne was saying like, "Toby, you got to do a lightning talk. You owe it to Shoes in the community to do a lightning talk." So I threw together a lightning talk and gave it. And I was very nervous because, it's one thing staying in front of rugby for like, at the time, I think 40 people, which I was already super nervous. But there's like, 200 people, but you probably can't see it right, but like all the way to the side of that picture, there's Steve Klabnik again, because he was at the same conference. And like I came up, I was the first lightning talk. And he looked at me, and was like, "Oh, Toby, you're giving a lightning talk about shoes? Awesome!" And then, he prepared the mic and gave me the mic, and that was like a big, confidence boost for myself to give this talk. And finally, I gave yes, this is how I used to dress. I would still like to dress like this, but it's very hard to find green pants in like a grown man size. But my first conference talk was at JRubyConf, and I also talked about shoes. And so this also started my speaking career, or like me speaking at conferences, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of the learning I did was also through shoes. Like, because the layout was much like the web, I learned a lot about like front-end development, writing shoes, right? Because like I needed to program how it should look like, how a margin applies, and how all of this applies. And so it made me a lot better front-end developer as well. But also, all the other projects basically came for shoes. I already told you that after Do, I did for shoes. SimpleCoff, I did through shoes because I want to have JRuby officially supported for shoes. And even my love for benchmarking. We had a performance problem in shoes. And my buddy Jason, he benchmarked it. And he improved it a lot. And I wrote a blog post about it called "The Not So Low Cost of Calling Dynamically Defined Methods," which was very, very cool to me. And so my love from benchmarking came from that. And that's why I created Benchy in Elixir, because I love benchmarking. So yeah, basically all of the really cool community stuff I did, I owe to shoes. And so with that, thank you very much, and please enjoy open source programming.
Thank you. That was awesome. Thank you very much.